Despite the fact that DDR5 RAM is already striding around the world, the most adequate and popular PC builds are still holding on to DDR4. The difference in benchmark results is still not great, which cannot be said about the price. But they say a penny saved is a penny earned, so many people would rather go on AliExpress and get the cheapest RAM they can find. Having made 2 videos about cheap SSDs from China, we just couldn't miss out on RAM. We bought 7 popular RAM kits from China for a review, and it turned out to be exactly the way we love it. The basement-locked engineers have presented many surprises. We got everything from modules that wouldn't start out of the box, ones that didn't have regular certifications, to those with different chips from different batches. We even had a Joule that almost managed to hit 4 GHz. Anyway, this is MK. Let's dive into all sorts of rejected RAM. Let's run through our test subjects. We bought memory from the most popular brands on AliExpress. They are Kllisre, Geil, Jazer, Tanbassh, Atermiter, Kingbank, and YongXinSheng.
YongXinSheng.
All modules were selected by price and frequency, no more than $12 or $13 per 8GB DDR4 at 3200. The only exception is Kingbank, which offered a 16GB module with XMP at 3600 MHz for $16, which was too tempting not to try. And by the way, these RAM kits actually managed to surprise us. We tested these guys on an i9-9900K with release stepping and with an Asus ROG Strix Z370F board. Such a build is capable of working with RAM at frequencies above 4000 MHz, so it's more than capable of revealing all the potential hidden in these RAM kits. Let's start with modules from the notorious Kllisre, who produce everything, from video cards to memory, SSDs, and even motherboards. This is an advanced Chinese company specializing in replacing nameplates on products of questionable quality. The more interesting it is to see what they're hiding. In the description, we are promised manual verification of each module, as well as operation at 3200 MHz at CL22 with 1.2 volts. That is, in fact, it complies with JEDEC. They also promise heat sinks with the best heat dissipation parameters and the capability of overclocking. So which of these is true? Literally nothing. But first, let's look at the package. By looking at it, you can immediately understand what kind of RAM is inside. On paper, the manufacturer promises us as many as 3 years of warranty. At the same time, the sides of the box are sealed with branded Kllisre tape, which directly indicates that the product is of high quality. Inside, as promised, there are 2 modules at 3200 MHz CL22. And the first thing that you notice when you take such a Kllisre in your hands is that the RAM is very lightweight. Although the heatsink is not plastic, it is metal and conducts current. We checked this with a multimeter. It is so thin that if you make it even a bit thinner, it will become foil. Of course, you don't even need one to cool a default DDR4, but we were promised heatsinks suitable for overclocking. And if you look closely, this so-called heatsink has a contact with one of the SMD elements on the PCB. The paint does not conduct current, but if you're unlucky and there's a scratch or the paint layer is too thin, there's a chance that it will short circuit and die, taking your CPU and motherboard with it. Thus, it is better to bend the heatsink slightly out of harm's way or apply electrical tape to the capacitors. Now, let's plug these guys in and see what they can do. Firing up the computer, the system boots up successfully. But when you try to open at least something more demanding than Windows Explorer, it crashes instantly. But wait, we were promised manually tested modules. Well, let's enter the BIOS and figure it out. In the BIOS, it doesn't look good. The module manufacturer is not registered. I guess they failed to figure out the firmware of the SPD controller. There is no XMP either, however, nobody promised it anyway. The timings are set at CL17, although the module has written on it CL22, which is a lot worse. Does it mean that we actually got a better product than we were promised? To check this, we had to set the voltage to 1.35 volts. Apparently, for these memory chips, 3200 MHz already can be called overclocking, so you will not be able to do so with the standard 1.2 volts. Now the system is loaded normally, and we can see the RAM information from CPU-Z and AIDA64. Both programs show that the memory is by Kllisre, but they cannot determine the chip manufacturer. But this is not what surprises the most. Both programs show JEDEC only up to 2600 MHz. while the memory started at 3200 out of the box. How is this possible? Let's try to recall what JEDEC is. This is a consortium of engineers who have been developing many standards in electronics for more than 60 years, including for RAM. The JEDEC RAM standard is used and understood by all major manufacturers of motherboards, processors, and memory. And for example, in the case of DDR4, it includes several dozen profiles with frequencies from 1600 to 3200 MHz and timings from CL10 to 24, strictly at a voltage of 1.2 volts. Accordingly, each memory manufacturer who wants their kits to work with any boards installs the JEDEC profiles that are supposed to be supported by the RAM kit into the SPD chip. This ensures that both the processor and the board will be able to choose a profile with the frequency and timings that all three of them will definitely support. Actually, this is what makes JEDEC different from XMP, DOCP, or EXPO. The last three are actually the same profiles with information about frequency, timings, and voltages, but already beyond the JEDEC standard. That is, they are considered overclocking and their stability is not guaranteed. Back to our Kllisre, which has neither JEDEC nor XMP at 3200 MHz. That is, the manufacturer set the frequency bypassing international standards. Moreover, forgot to include the timings. As a result, the motherboard had to pick the timings by itself and chose CL17. And this goes beyond JEDEC, which at a frequency of 3200 MHz and a voltage of 1.2 volts guarantees stability only at CL20 and higher. That's why it failed to start properly under the default settings. On top of that, even at 1.35 volts CL17, the memory turned out to be unstable according to testmem. So I had to open the BIOS again and select CL18. In this mode, Kllisre works stably. It passed one cycle of absolute profile in testmem, which guarantees stable operation on most workloads. The memory benchmark in AIDA64 scored about 45 GB per second for read and write speed with delays of 52 nanoseconds. For 3200 MHz, this result is not bad, but by no means record-breaking. Alas, this is the limit. Even at 3400 MHz CL18, it turned out to be unstable, and increasing the frequency even further would make no sense, for the timings would have to go up as well. Let's tear down this thing and see what's under the heatsink made of chinanium. We decided to run tests first and then tear it down second, as there's a chance to leave a couple of chips glued to this thermal interface while removing the heatsink. At first glance, everything seems to be fine. The chips are labeled SEC, which means they're made by Samsung. But if you look closely, you can see that they all come from different batches with different data codes. On top of that, some of the chips are obviously used. This can be seen by their color. That is, Kllisre took random memory chips by Samsung, perhaps from other RAM kits or mining equipment, maybe some of them used to work in laptops. It is obvious that overclocking is out of question here. The more important question is, how long will such memory kits last for? In short, Kllisre is trash. The next in line are simple black modules by Tanbassh. The product description boasts of high performance and long stable operation. Nothing new here. Although I'm pleased with the honesty of this manufacturer. They're not trying to hide that they're using chips from random batches. And here too, there is not a word about XMP. Does it mean that this is JEDEC at 3200 MHz CL22? But no, the sticker on the module firmly and clearly says that the XMP profile is still there. At the same time, you can easily see that they are using the same package for all their kits, and inside there is only the RAM stick in a cheapest plastic case and nothing else. In this case, the memory chips are not covered by a heatsink. The manufacturer is also Samsung. A more detailed study makes it clear that Tanbassh went the same way as Kllisre. All the chips are from different batches, and they also got scratches all over, which means they are used. Let's run our tests. Our computer equipped with Tanbassh starts without problems, and the 3200 MHz XMP profile at CL19 is identified in the BIOS. Meanwhile, the memory manufacturer is undefined, so Tanbassh engineers, same as Kllisre, have not yet learned how to fill in the SPD profile correctly. XMP is applied without problems, and the AIDA64 memory test shows the absolutely expected 45 GB per second read and write speed with delays of 53 nanoseconds. At the same time, the program clearly shows that this RAM stick is actually by Tanbassh, and the chips are Samsung, and even supposedly new, mid-2023. Running testmem with absolute profile also shows full stability. Well, it turns out that in this case the manufacturer didn't cheat, and even vice versa. There is easy one-click overclocking via XMP, even though it was not promised. But 3200 MHz CL19 is not very cool. 3600 would sound a lot better, but alas, TestMem quickly begins to show errors, even taking into account the fact that I have slightly increased the voltage in the BIOS to 1.4 volts. 3500 MHz with the same timings turned out to be absolutely stable. Still, squeezing anything else out of it is a no-go. As a result, the read and write speed in AIDA64 have increased to 48 to 50 GB per second, and the delay has dropped below 50 nanoseconds. Such a result for a $13 RAM stick is not bad at all. Normally, 2400 MHz modules are not capable of this, but there is a caveat. Firstly, the chips are random, and the manufacturer confirms that they use not only Samsung, but also Micron, Hynix, and Nanya, and therefore, you can get a worse RAM stick, or maybe a better one. And say in a year or two you would want to get another such module to complement the ones you already have, the chance of getting the same quality module would be comparable to that of winning a lottery. In addition, keep in mind that they are using chips that have been in operation before, and the information in AIDA that they were released in early August is false, since I ordered them on AliExpress literally a couple of weeks later. Whether these chips actually worked, how old they are, and how long they will last, the question is yet to be answered. And secondly, these modules come with no heatsink. Yes, the default DDR4 memory at 1.2 volt is cool enough and can do without additional heat dissipation, but having a heatsink won't hurt when overclocking RAM with used memory chips at 1.4 volts. The general verdict is that the modules are junk. It's not worth buying them. Next in line are Kingbank, the only 16GB modules out of the whole set. And even at 3600 MHz, the seller specifically indicates that they do support XMP profiles, but at the same time, curiously, the description mentions several times that the memory is not suitable for AMD platform, and this is strange. We know that it used to be a thing in DDR2 and DDR3, but there is not a word about it in DDR4, even on the internet. But it is unlikely that the seller would want to deprive himself of a part of the profit. Apparently, these modules have some minor issues that may not allow them to work in AMD boards correctly. Since our test bench is an Intel computer, there shouldn't be any problems. The first thing that catches your eye is the inscription on the package that says, "widely compatible." Is it some sort of bipolar disorder? The other side of the box shows that the manufacturer was simply too lazy to make different packages for different modules they sell. The Kingbank sticker is the same for all modules. This time the RAM sticks do have a heatsink, but again, almost made of foil. On top of that, they share another feature with Kllisre. The metal practically touches one of the SMD elements on the PCB. Let's move on to the tests. We immediately go into the BIOS and see the same picture. The manufacturer is undefined, but at least they really do have an XMP profile at 3600 MHz CL18, which is applied without problems. This time, AIDA64 managed to determine what memory it is. The manufacturer is Kingbank, and the chips are again by Samsung, again allegedly new from early August. The autopsy will show us the truth. The XMP profile turned out to be completely stable. 50 GB per second read and write speed with delays below 50 nanoseconds in the AIDA64 benchmark can be called an excellent level in the 32 GB set at a price of $35. Let's try overclocking it. And that's where Kingbank pleasantly surprised me. At still safe 1.4 volts, it overclocked to 4000 MHz and even passed the AIDA64 benchmark, given 53 to 55 GB per second with delays of 46 nanoseconds, which is an excellent result. Alas, it turned out to be unstable in this mode. After an hour of hard stress test, a couple of errors still occurred. Of course, it may not affect your games in any way, but I still can't recommend using unstable memory in your PC, even if the instability is so slight. Raising the timings even higher won't get us anywhere. Same applies to the voltage, which means that the only thing that remains is to lower the frequency to 3800 MHz. And in this mode, after one cycle in TestMem, everything is fine. The results in AIDA64 have of course decreased a bit. It is 51 to 53 GB per second with delays of 47 nanoseconds, but it's still a pretty good level. The teardown of the RAM sticks showed that the manufacturer marked each memory chip with their own name. But we remember that AIDA showed that the chips are actually by Samsung. Then why was it necessary to change the markings? Well, everything is simple. It was done so that it is impossible to see what kind of chips are actually installed. More likely, these chips also come from different batches as well as all of our previous contenders. Therefore, I cannot recommend getting such a memory, although it costs significantly cheaper than what you can find at your local retailer. Let's add a little spark to our tests. The red module by Jazer, which seems to have been quite popular recently. And this popularity is understandable. 8GB at 3200 MHz for only $10. In the description, we are promised XMP at 3200 MHz. The modules should work with both Intel and AMD, and at the same time at a voltage of 1.2 volts, which raises questions given that they have XMP. But that's what we're here for. Let's check this out. Jazer has cut some corners producing the package, just plastic blisters with a paper insert on which the main specs are written. And what surprised me the most after all the RAM sticks we tested was that the heat sinks here were actually good. They are still a bit worse than those by famous manufacturers, they are lighter, but they are not foil. So let's install the RAM and launch into the BIOS. There are no surprises here. The modules are marked undefined, but the XMP profile at 3200 MHz is available. And of course with a voltage of 1.35 volts, so 1.2 in the description is a lie. But even this is not the worst. The AIDA64 test with default settings surprised us the most. Only 37 to 40 GB per second with delays of 55 nanoseconds, and this is at CL18. This result can be called good for memory at frequency of 2666 MHz, but at 3200 I wanna see at least 5 GB per second more. And overclocking will not help us fix the situation. The modules are unstable even at 3400 MHz with a voltage risen to 1.4, but at 3200 MHz we managed to shrink the timings to CL16, which raised the read speed by a couple of gigabytes per second and also reduced the delays to a more pleasant 51 nanoseconds. The result is mediocre, but the modules are the cheapest, only $10 a piece. Let's tear it down. AIDA64 reported to us that the module had Micron chips in it, but inside we see Jazer. Yes, the situation is like with Kingbank. The manufacturer was not lazy and put their name on the chips, which means that they had something to hide, and that the history of origin of these chips is again unknown. As a result, taking into account the extremely low speed for 3200 MHz, I will not recommend Jazer. If it offered at least 45 GB per second for the same $10, it would be a great option. But here, in fact, we have the performance of regular modules at 2400 or 2666 MHz, which can be easily found for the same price. Although with only 4 memory banks on one side, the result was expected. Jazer obviously decided to forget about the rings alternation. Next on our test bench are modules from a typical small Chinese company that decided not to bother with a short name in Latin. I wouldn't even have noticed it if not for the number of sales, almost 15,000 pieces. In this case, the price tag is not particularly pleasant. A set of 2 modules of 8 GB at 3200 MHz cost $28. These are some of the most expensive modules among those we tested today. But does higher price mean higher quality? Let's check, but first we'll study the description. We are promised not only compatibility with AMD and Intel, but also with Xeon processors. On top of that, the seller for some reason got into the wilds of explaining the rings, although such a choice is not offered. There is no XMP profile either. I'm glad that at least they honestly warned about the use of random memory chips. At the same time, the description is quite concise, and there is not a single photoshopped picture like with other brands tested. After such a description, it is not even surprising that there is only an unpronounceable brand name repeated 3 times on the package and nothing else. The sticker on the module sheds some light on the specs. They promise us 3200 MHz at CL22 1.2 volts. That is, a clear compliance with JEDEC, which is good. I was also pleasantly surprised by the heatsink. Yes, it's also thin here, but it doesn't touch the elements on the board, so we'll start right away. In the BIOS, we find with interest that it was not YongXinSheng who produced these modules. Panram did. This is an old Chinese vendor that has been working for almost 30 years, and of course they sell their memory kits to third parties. There is no XMP profile as promised, while the frequency out of the box is 3200 MHz and the voltage is 1.2 volts. The only thing that's confusing is the timings. They are CL19, which is again beyond JEDEC. But at the same time, the system booted up in this mode without any problems, and AIDA64 confirmed the concerns. The frequency was again set in violation of JEDEC, which goes only up to 2900 MHz. Therefore, a question arises: why was it necessary to indicate on the module about CL22 if in fact it is not present in the SPD, and the motherboards choose timings independently? Although it's quite possible that YongXinSheng engineers didn't even touch these modules at all, since in the system they are identified simply with the identification number, most likely by pan-RAM. Anyway, in this mode, the modules consistently pass the absolute memory test, and there are no complaints about the speeds and delays in the 8064 benchmark, 46 to 49 GB per second at 55 nanoseconds, which is an expected result for a frequency of 3200 MHz at CL19. At the same time, the modules are not alien to some small overclocking. By raising the voltage to 1.35 volts, we managed to achieve stable operation at 3400 MHz. In this case, it is 48 to 51 GB per second read and write speed, with delays of about 51 nanoseconds. Alas, it didn't work out to shrink the timings, so there's another question for YongXinSheng. What's so cool about this memory that you're asking 40% more money for it than say Jazer does? Perhaps the answer lies under the heatsink, and in there lies only disappointment. I expected cheap but new chips from such a large vendor as PanRAM. But no, these are still the same Samsung chips from random batches and with the traces of wear. That is, in fact, YongXinSheng is no different from Tanbassh or Kllisre in quality, but at the same time, they turned out to be the most impudent as to put a price tag higher than the rest. Therefore, the verdict is no different. Do not buy this. Then there's another manufacturer of motherboards for Xeon processors who also decided to produce some RAM. RAM kits by Atermiter sell great on AliExpress. There are 50,000 sales in several lots, so we couldn't pass by and ordered a couple of 8GB modules at 3200 MHz for $13 each. What does the seller offer us for such money? To begin with, compatibility with AMD and Intel. Below in red letters, there's a warning that the modules may not work on boards with AMD A320 chipset and Ryzen G series processors, that is, with integrated graphics, as well as variations where the iGPU is disabled, that is, for example, in Ryzen 5 5500. In addition, in small print, Atermiter reluctantly admits that they use chips coming from random batches. There is no information about XMP. The inscription on the package says that this is memory for gaming, so those of you who are considering it for productivity tasks, forget about it. Also, on the package, there's a link to the store and even a phone number, but such a trifle as the specs is nowhere to be found. Perhaps it's not that important. It may seem to you that there are 2 modules in each such package. That is, the seller made a mistake and sent 4 modules instead of 2, but this is not the case. It's just that a third of each box is filled with air. But okay, the package doesn't affect performance, so let's get down to it. The heat sinks are very light, and the only advantage is that they do not touch any elements on the PCB. But then happened a completely unexpected turn of events. The computer refused to start with this memory. Rather, it did turn on, but then it would just freeze. With the third attempt, the board realized that something was wrong and it allowed to enter the BIOS in safe mode. In it, the memory was determined correctly. And surprise, it is the same brand as YongXinSheng, that is, PanRAM. The frequency was set at 3200 MHz 1.2 volts, but the timings the board picked was CL21. Formally, memory should work in this mode. This is one of the JEDEC profiles, but it is a low-frequency module, forcibly overclocked by basement-locked engineers to 3200 MHz. Therefore, I immediately set 1.35 volts, and in this mode, the RAM starts without a problem. And then it turns out that the Chinese accidentally declassified their early developments. Not only is the memory in 8064 defined simply as Atermiter without any mention of frequency and volume, but also the production date says the year 2000. That is, at the time when everyone used SD RAM, the Chinese engineers had already developed DDR4. This is of course a joke. In fact, Atermiter simply failed to enter the SPD information correctly. There is also no data on the chips used, so we will find out the truth after the teardown. There are no questions about the test results in such a formally default mode. They are even pleasantly surprising, taking into account CL21 timings. 45 GB per second for read and write speed with delays of only 55 nanoseconds. At the same time, the overclocking failed completely. Even at 1.4 volts, it was not possible to consistently run at 3400 MHz. The maximum result was that we managed to shrink the timings to CL19, which reduced the delays to 52 nanoseconds. This kind of overclocking potential sucks, frankly speaking. So it's time to crack it open and see what's inside. I expected Samsung chips here as well, but this is Hynix, and that's where all the differences end. Again, the chips come from different batches with an unknown history, so the verdict is the same. These modules are trash. And the last contender is Geil. The reason why I left this one for the end is as follows. Unlike all other brands tested today, Geil started working on memory back in the 90s, and there's great hope that this manufacturer did everything right. In addition to their usual beautiful pictures that this memory is for gaming and it's easily configurable, there is also a table with the specs, where we are promised CL18 timings at a frequency of 3200 MHz and a voltage of 1.35, which hints at an XMP profile. Geil uses the same package for all their memory, but the content is slightly more generous than the rest. In addition to the blister with the RAM stick, there is also a Chinese warranty memo. Of course, when buying from AliExpress, it is of no use, but again, it confirms that Geil is the only manufacturer in today's test that really thinks about quality and warranty. The modules are covered by light metal heatsinks, but the gaps are okay. Also, on the modules, there are warranty stickers and brief specifications that confirm the data from the description. Let's insert them into our PC, and in the BIOS, we immediately see another confirmation that the brand is okay. The modules are marked as Geil. As expected, there is an XMP profile at 3200 MHz CL18, which is applied without problems. In AIDA64, the memory is also displayed as Geil, and with XMP profile enabled, the memory passes the absolute test successfully. The benchmark results in this mode are expected. About 45 GB per second for reading and writing with delays of 53 nanoseconds. These modules are also friends with overclocking. We managed to raise the frequency to 3600 MHz. But the timings didn't shrink at all. In any case, for a 3200 MHz kit, the result is good. In the AIDA64 benchmark, it was possible to get 49 to 50 GB per second with delays of 49 nanoseconds. As a result, we have the correct marking in SPD here, good overclocking, and a warranty. Can it be that we have finally found a good, honest manufacturer? Alas! After we removed the heatsink, we saw random memory chips by Samsung with all kinds of wear and tear. I admit, it was a shame. Up to the last moment, I could not believe that Geil would cheat like Kllisre or Tanbassh, but the reality is harsh. These are actually all the same low-grade modules except with a beautifully printed warranty sticker. So the verdict doesn't change. This memory goes to waste as well. You know, after testing a dozen Chinese no-name SSDs, I thought I was ready for anything, but just think about it. All 7 sets of popular RAM from AliExpress turned out to be completely useless trash. They are made from used chips of different batches, some with changed data codes. Half of the modules are ordinary 2400 MHz ones, forcibly overclocked to 3200 in violation of all standards. A couple of modules can kill your PC, and with some, it just won't start out of the box. We have already seen something similar in SSDs, but those are not much cheaper than what you can find in your local store, so buying those makes no sense at all. But with RAM, the situation is exactly the opposite. 16 GB of Jazer cost $20. The cheapest modules at 3200 MHz by a famous brand would be at least 50% more expensive. And for 32 GB at 3600 MHz by Kingbank, you will pay less than $30. This is cheaper than the simplest 16 GB kit you can find locally. That is, the Chinese are dumping their prices, which attracts literally hundreds of thousands of buyers. In any case, I cannot recommend such memory for purchase. Only Mao alone knows how long they will last for, and the warranty is only 2 weeks from the moment of receipt. But since I have experience and know that this will not stop many, here are a couple of tips for choosing less junky junk. First, carefully read the description. If the seller writes that memory will not work on some platforms, there is no point in not believing them. Secondly, it is worth getting only modules for which the XMP profile is specified. In this case, it is at least some kind of guarantee. We have all 3 sets for which such an overclocking profile was specified. They worked with it without any problems. The kits for which a high frequency without XMP is indicated are better to be avoided. Tests show that these are ordinary low-frequency modules forcibly overclocked to 3200 MHz bypassing JEDEC, with which they often don't even start or work unstably. And thirdly, if you have already decided to take a risk and save money, buy the maximum amount of memory you need. you will not be able to buy the same modules from the same seller later. And even if you do, it will be a completely different set of chips, and chances are the new ones would only work at 2400 JEDEC. But the best way out is to look for discounts for the memory by famous vendors at your local retailer. Of course, you will not be able to find a Data or HyperX at the price of Jazer or Atermiter, but still, you'd have a warranty and at least some quality. I feel like I know what's going to happen in the comment section under this video, the same thing that happened with both Chinese SSDs and Xeon processors. I suggest you choose the best kit out of these 7. If you are yourself a user of such or similar RAM, please write about your experience. Maybe you can recommend something. This was MK. My name is Kllisre, and I'll see you again. Bye.